vampires of the world, with a concentration on the vampires of New York City, the very ones that I explored when I was doing research for my book, The Hunger. There's something very eerie out there, folks. And then for subscribers at the Dreamland Festival, I had an extraordinary experience. Marla Fries was channeling and doing her work as a medium when suddenly the dead, my dead and my wife's dead, showed up in my life. There followed a communication which is beyond dispute real. And for subscribers, we talk about that. We explain why it was so real, why it had to be real, and exactly what it was. It's a moving and deeply amazing thing as far as I'm concerned. I never dreamed I could do anything like that, especially not in such a credible and provable way. It just blew me away. So subscribers, don't miss it. And also, if you're not a subscriber, now's your chance. You can get a copy of the Omega Point autographed by me, the hardcover of the Omega Point autographed by me, if you renew your existing subscription to unknowncountry.com for 1 year, or if you start a new 1-year subscription to unknowncountry.com. That has to happen for the next week. That is the next 7 days from Friday, July the 9th at 6 a.m. till Friday, July the 16th at midnight. You are guaranteed to get an autographed copy of the Omega Point, but you must subscribe for a year or more, or renew your existing subscription for a year or more in order to get this premium. So go to unknowncountry.com and click on that subscribe tab, or if you are a subscriber, go into your account and extend your subscription for a year. You need do nothing else. The copy will come automatically. This promotion is valid for U.S. mailing addresses only. Unfortunately, we cannot afford to ship these premiums abroad.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
Well, as you know, I have a certain amount of interest in vampires, having written The Hunger back in the day, and then more recently, The Last Vampire and Lilith's Dream. And I have always taken quite an interest in this field, in that when I was doing research for The Hunger, I got into the dark side of it a little bit. And not that it's necessarily true that there are any real vampires around, but there are certainly some very peculiar people around, as we're going to find out today from Joe Laycock. Joe Laycock has written a book called Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism, and he is a doctoral candidate at Boston University. And with that said, I'd like to welcome you to the show, Joe.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's exciting to have you, and I really must say that I enjoyed Vampires Today. I want to start out with a story that I know a little bit about, which is the story of Susan Walsh, which you comment on in your book. I met Susan Walsh about a month before, I guess, she disappeared. And folks, for those of you who don't know, Susan was an aspiring reporter for the Village Voice, and she was running around trying to do stories while working, I believe, as a pole dancer or stripper or something. I forget exactly what she said, but she was wanting to break into reporting, and she had decided to do a story about vampires, real vampires in Manhattan. And she contacted me because of the fact that I had written The Hunger, and she thought that I might have some idea, I might have done some research that could help her. And I wasn't able to give her any particular leads, but I was able to tell her that it was, there were people, there was a community, a sort of Gothic community in Manhattan at the time, and she said an interesting thing to me. She said, well, she knew all about them and that she was really on to something. And then, about a month or two later, I received information, or rather read in the newspaper, I guess, that she had disappeared. I always wondered about that, Joe. I had no evidence, nothing to offer the police whatsoever. But what do you think happened? In your book, you come up with a very different theory, that she wasn't actually eaten by vampires, but something else quite interesting and unexpected happened to her.
Right. Well, it's certainly an amazing story, the disappearance of Susan Walsh, and of course this inspired Catherine Ramsland, who is also a journalist amongst other things, to write her book Piercing the Darkness, where she sort of
Yes.
goes looking to find out what happened to Susan Walsh. I was, getting my driver's license when Susan Walsh disappeared. I was in high school. And so what I did researching this book was I was able to speak to some of sort of the old guard vampires from the New York scene. And of course what's happened is that if you were a vampire in Manhattan around the time that Susan Walsh disappeared, then you're very sort of respected and you have a lot of sort of mystique in the community. And so
Yes.
unfortunately, from talking to different vampires that had sort of had a fallen out, I got different accounts of what had happened. I think the most likely explanation that I heard, and one vampire that I spoke with is now involved in law enforcement, is that probably her disappearance was related to an article that she had written on the Russian mafia and their involvement with the sex trade, which she was reporting on. And so the account that I heard from one of my contacts was basically that very few people had the resources to create a sort of total disappearance because a body was never found and this sort of thing, and so that the mafia was sort of the most likely group that would have had the resources to do something like that. But other people have suggested that she, of course, is still alive and decided to sort of lay low. And it's now been more than 10 years, of course, since her disappearance. So
Yeah, her and Andy Kaufman, maybe they're living together. I don't somehow think so. However, you mentioned something kind of interesting, a vampire who has entered law enforcement. Could you tell us something more about that?
Yeah, this individual started out in New York, and before he was from a family of police officers, and before he actually became part of the force, he was involved in sort of policing the vampire community in Manhattan, and his title there was sheriff. And this is a community that believes a lot in sort of policing themselves and making sure that no one sort of draws negative attention to their community if they can help it. So he eventually moved down south, where I was able to interview him. He got a job in local law enforcement. He made detective fairly quickly. And then, unfortunately, he did a piece recently with ABC, and that actually caused some fallout for him with his job in law enforcement. ABC sort of inadvertently outed him. So this is another thing that I've spoken of with the book is we have to think about what society will look like when we are living with vampires that are law enforcement officers and nurses and things like that, because he made detective because he was a good cop, not because of his identity or what he happened to believe or what have you. So this is an interesting case to think about in terms of dealing with different types of people.
Let me ask you this. Why did you get, or perhaps I should say, why in the world did you get interested in this subject?
Well, it's interesting. I first started doing this type of research working for the Pluralism Project at Harvard. And when I worked for the Pluralism Project, I would sort of go out to different temples and mosques and things like that, and kind of create awareness that these groups were living with us and sort of what kinds of problems they were having and how they were fitting in and so forth. And I was living in Atlanta. I was actually teaching high school, and I just sort of happened to find out about this group called the Atlanta Vampire Alliance, which has been a very active group of vampires, particularly in terms of the research they produce that other vampires have been contributing to and reading. And so I approached them in the same way that I approached these other religious groups that I have worked with, and I said, I'm a researcher, and I would like to do a sort of a win-win. I would like to get a research paper out of working with your group, and I would like for this to be something that would foster understanding about vampires and what you're about. So it was very much the opposite approach of someone like Catherine Ramsland, who actually sort of infiltrated these vampire groups and put on the fangs and the contact lenses and tried to blend in. I didn't do that at all. I took sort of the opposite approach.
I see. So, but it was just, I was really looking for whether or not you had, what psychological impetus you had, in that it's an unusual area to want to research at all. Even to think that there are modern vampires is odd, frankly.
Well, I think most people are aware there are modern vampires somewhere in the world.
And we're going to find out what they are in a few minutes, folks, so keep listening. Go ahead.
I think most people know somewhere out there are people that wear fangs and drink blood, and they probably meet in secret nightclubs or something like that. So I think there's a lot of interest there. There just wasn't a very good way to sort of go out and research it. There never has been a good way to research this community. A lot of people assume that I must be some sort of huge vampire freak to take on a project like this, which isn't really true compared to scholars like Gordon Melton, J. Gordon Melton, who really is, in my opinion, a bit of a vampire freak. This was more of a crime of opportunity. I'm a young scholar. And it's very hard for me to publish something that's never been said before about, say, Christianity or the Bible.
Right.
But with vampires, here was a place where I could really sort of do some groundbreaking research and sort of make my mark.
So you went down the same road that Susan Walsh went down, but you're still alive.
That's right. I am.
Lucky for you.
Well, people ask me a lot if I ever, was concerned about my safety or anything like that doing this research, and I wasn't at all. Particularly the Atlanta Vampire Alliance are very sort of protective, friendly, down-to-earth people. So my experiences were very different from these reports I hear of people up in the New York nightclubs.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more in a few minutes about the people up in the New York nightclubs, because I had personally a fair amount of experience with that and went back to it when I was writing The Last Vampire, just to sort of see what was going on. And I was amazed to find that after all of those years, it had been a good 20 years since I wrote The Hunger, there was still a thriving vampire community in New York. I mean, it's not 1 million people, but it's certainly 500 or 600 at least.
Oh, yes.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the vampire scene in New York is definitely sort of the most, elaborate and sophisticated and sort of baroque, and it hasn't really been replicated anywhere else. But in New York, you can find actual courts of vampires who have titles, and they hold these sort of salons, and they'll send emissaries to other courts of vampires out in New Jersey and elsewhere. And there are vampires all over, but you really don't find that sort of scene anywhere else.
No. Have you tried London?
I haven't been to London. I know that there are communities of vampires that have existed in the United Kingdom. And the impression that I get is that they are more reluctant to kind of come out and express themselves than
very
here in
reluctant,
the US.
because they're heavily into black magic in England. And I think they're pretty dangerous, actually. It's not a group I would consort with too willingly, because they may want things from me that I don't necessarily want to give them or know I would give them without, well, let's put it this way. They're creepy. Okay, now not to say the New York vampires aren't creepy. They are creepy. And we're going to come back and ask Joe, what exactly is a vampire, a modern vampire? Because this is a very interesting question, and we're also trying to find out why everybody is so fascinated with vampires. We'll be right back. Joe, in the book Vampires Today, which, by the way, is available in bookstores, it's from Prager. And he certainly has done a great job here and was probably right to go into this scholarly backwater in order to publish. And he's done a beautiful, just absolutely fascinating book. He says, I argue that the vampire identity represents an adaptation to the conditions of modernity. Now, what about the modern world has made us increasingly interested in vampires? Because there's a long line now from Dracula, starting out with the Sheridan Le Fanu and the Horla, and then Dracula, and then gradually until the present. There's never been a period when vampire interest has waned, and now it's gigantic.
Yeah, I mean it's a bit of a mystery. With modernity, people have increasingly more and more choices to make about their lifestyle. That's one of the most important features of modernity. So it used to be that you would live in, a village or something your entire life, and everyone in the village had the same religion and had the same job and everything else. And now, of course, it's not like that at all. You don't know growing up where you're going to live or what the right sort of spiritual path is for you. And now, of course, you don't know if you're gay or straight necessarily. So there's all these different, choices that weren't there before. And I think that now what we're seeing is, am I a regular human being or am I a vampire, is coming to be another one of these choices that people make. And so, of course, vampires, the belief in vampires is very old, but with modernity, they become an increasingly sort of sympathetic figure and a more sort of a figure that can be identified with more. The old stories from Eastern Europe, these creatures are really sort of demons. They don't really have personalities. They just sort of skulk around at night and so forth. And then you get figures like Dracula, who's still a villain, but he has an interesting backstory and he has some good qualities as well, although they're sort of corrupted. And then you get increasingly more sympathetic vampires, and you get the sort of anti-heroes that Anne Rice wrote about. Now, finally, you have Twilight, where you have this vampire who's really sort of a saint and just drinks animal blood, and he's not really bad at all. He's just kind of misunderstood. And so we've gone from sort of using vampires as something other that kind of defines us as being normal people to now being kind of equals with vampires. So it's a very interesting shift that's been going on for a very long time.
As a result of which, we have these vampire groups, and there's something else, though, that is tied into this, and that is some of these groups, I think, or I thought, were involved with some even darker practices in the area of Satanism and occult societies. And as my listeners know, I have an absolute horror of these occult societies because of their power. And I don't mean supernatural power. I mean the fact that Theosophy was picked up by Aleister Crowley, the supposedly most evil man in the world of the early 20th century, and twisted into something very different and emerged in theoretical form in the Vril Society in Germany, which then became the basis for Nazi anti-Semitic ideology. And so I think they're dangerous in ways that perhaps we don't expect. Tell us a little bit about some of these groups, like the Left Hand Path, and let's just get into this a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say these groups that you're describing, there definitely are left-hand path groups of vampires that sort of model vampirism as being kind of a religion. But that having been said, I should also tell you that I met many Christian vampires while doing this, and vampires who think that. Yeah, and vampires
what's a Christian vampire like?
Well, generally these are people that were raised Christian. They never sort of became alienated from their church, but they, for whatever reason, came to identify as being a vampire. They sort of said, "Well, why do I have these strange feelings or these strange reactions?" But they never sort of turned their back on the church. So this was particularly interesting in the South, in the Bible Belt, where there were actually several vampires that were going to church every Sunday and didn't want anyone there to know that that they were a vampire. And in one case, someone was actually outed by a newspaper, and the church basically told them, you're not welcome here anymore. So I don't want you to think that all vampires are involved with these sort of left-hand path occult groups, but of course some definitely are.
Well, of course, I'm not. In my case, I'm certainly not welcome in my local Catholic church because I wrote a book called Communion, which they think has something to do with Catholicism, but they've never read it, of course.
Well, I've read your book. I didn't see anything about Catholicism in there myself.
That's because there's nothing in it about Catholicism. That would be the reason. Now, the Church of Satan, founded in San Francisco by Anton LaVey, has always been something I found a little disturbing and dangerous. And could you tell us a little bit about this movement, modern Satanism in general, and the Order of the Vampire, et cetera, and so forth?
Sure. So Anton LaVey, according to his own writings and stuff, said that he was an atheist, and that he viewed Satan as a metaphor for sort of what you might call antisocial behavior. Not illegal behavior, but saying that basically this sort of radical individualism that he does not need to conform to sort of the social and religious mores of his society. And of course, in San Francisco in the 1960s, this was very appealing to a lot of people who were involved in sort of the sexual revolution and this kind of thing. And of course, LaVey did read these various occult writers that you've described, Crowley and Theosophy and so forth. Out of the Church of Satan eventually formed another group called the Temple of Set, which said that we are not atheists, that there actually is a sort of supernatural entity called Set, who still embodies a sort of spirit of kind of rebellion and anarchy and so forth. And a woman within this group started an organization called the Order of the Vampire, and this is sort of the oldest of these vampire left-hand path occult groups. And it was marketed as sort of learning how to emulate the vampire as a way to develop kind of magical power and influence. So from what I know about the group, they would work on things like cultivating a powerful gaze, kind of like you see in the old Dracula movies and things like this. So that became a popular group within the satanic organization called the Temple of Set. And since then, you've had similar groups form, like, of course, the Temple of the Vampire, which is probably the most famous out in Washington, and similar groups. So they all follow this sort of left-hand path ideology, that sort of cultivating yourself is the most important thing, and that has to be more important than sort of social mores. It's also very much associated with this idea of social Darwinism, right? That you need to evolve into something sort of stronger than what you began as.
And there's a sense of helplessness in our world. And do you think that is one of the things that contributes to, at least to the people who are interested in becoming, in joining this community?
In joining the sort of left-hand path group, or the vampire
the vampire community in general. I'm sorry.
In general, yeah. It's interesting, the argument about helplessness. I hadn't really thought about that before, but there might be something to that. The Atlanta Vampire Alliance did this project surveying all the vampires they could find, and they did find a high rate of things like histories of sexual abuse and things like that. So it is possible that there's something appealing about this identity as a vampire, as a source of kind of empowerment. At the same time, I spoke with vampires that said, that they would rather be a normal person, that they don't want to be a vampire, that the sort of abilities that they have, intuition and things like this that come with vampirism, are kind of not worth having to feed on people's energy and things like this. So it's interesting. I don't know if that's what's driving the expansion of this community or not. I'm sure for some people that it is.
Is the community expanding quickly? You'd think it would be.
Yeah, it's hard to measure that. A lot of the sort of old guard, the vampires that are in their 40s, 50s, and older. I even met several vampire grandmothers while doing this research. Those seem to be sort of going underground and are a little bit less active on the internet and things like that. But of course, there's this huge surge of teenagers, right, who have just found out about this community through the internet and are wondering if they might be a vampire or not. And probably in 10 years, most of those teens will not be vampires, right? It will just be a phase. But for a few of them, this may come to be sort of a lasting identity. So I think in the long run, the community is probably going to grow.
We'll be back with Joe Laycock in just a minute. I'm going to ask him the question, what do you have to do if you're a vampire? How do you know you're a vampire? We'll be right back. We're talking to Joe Laycock. His book, Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism. Many years ago, I fell in love with a vampire. Her name, of course, was Miriam Blaylock, and my one problem was that she only existed in my mind until I met Catherine Deneuve, and then Miriam became very real in a curious way. Catherine, as I remember her, the brief meeting I had with her, could not have been farther from a vampire. She was a small, lovely, incredibly wonderful woman, and I met her very briefly. Then when I saw her in the movie, she had assumed the identity of my character so completely that it was a shock to me. And I fell in love all over again, but unfortunately the person I fell in love with still didn't exist. Now, what is a vampire in the sense of, you're a vampire. You get up in the morning. What do you do?
Well, there's several different kinds of vampires that comprise this community, and in my book I've actually had to make sort of a diagram to help you keep track of all the different types. So first of all, you have what are called lifestyle vampires versus real vampires. The lifestyle vampires just really enjoy kind of the aesthetic of vampires. They like the clothing, the makeup. They may wear fangs. They may even, in some cases, sleep in a coffin. But at the end of the day, they say this is just something that I'm very excited about. It's ultimately a lifestyle choice. I'm not actually different from other people. The real vampires, not so. They may dress like everyone else. They may dress in this sort of this look that's been called vampire drag. But what makes them different is that they say that they have to feed in order to maintain their health, right? Their mental, physical, emotional health.
When you say
now, there are different types of
when you say
feeding.
Joe, could you explain exactly what that word means in this case?
Right. Well, feeding doesn't always mean the same thing. So within the real vampires, you have several different types. You have the sanguinarian vampires, who are sort of your classical blood drinkers. They drink fairly small amounts of blood for the most part, usually from humans, although sometimes animal blood. And usually this blood is obtained from a willing donor, right? Someone who consents to have this person usually cut them with a syringe or a lancet or something and drink, a tablespoon or so of their blood. You also have what are called psychic vampires. Psychic vampires don't need to drink blood, but they feed on other people's energy. And they say that a lot of people are psychic vampires and don't know it. So you might have a friend, and whenever they show up, it feels like all of the energy has been drained out of the room. Well, this community would say that that's not just a metaphor, that this person really has drained all the energy out of the room, and that they actually need to do that because they're a psychic vampire.
Now, I know from my listenership that this is going to be the most interesting thing to everyone, and it is to me too. We've all met these people. We all know people like this. What do you think about them? What are they?
Well, it's very interesting. Since I've done this research, I've talked with people who study holistic medicine in China. I've spoken from people that grew up in India and so forth. And they all say, oh, of course, everyone knows there are people that drain out your energy. Right? We just don't call them vampires where I come from. So it does seem to be sort of a universal belief that there are people that do this. And, of course, one person I spoke to extensively researching this book is Michelle Belanger, who is a psychic vampire and an author. And her experience was that she began reading these occult books, right, which were by people like Dion Fortune and these other early 20th century occult writers who were writing to their readers to look out for these people called psychic vampires and how you can protect yourself from them. But when Michelle read this text, she thought not that I need to protect myself from psychic vampires. She thought, my gosh, I think I am one of these things. And I think that I am drawing people's energy out and making them get tired and making them get sick in some cases. And I need to sort of learn to control how I am feeding on people. So this has become the new model for these self-identified psychic vampires, that they need to learn how to feed in an ethical way.
There's something shocking about her face. Folks, in the book, there's quite a marvelous picture of her on page 113, presiding over a hand-fasting ritual. That is to say, a pagan marriage. It turns out there's a reason for that. She's an ordained minister, isn't she?
Yes, she does weddings and has done funerals. Michelle is really a fascinating figure, sort of a Renaissance woman. She's produced several albums as a singer. She's written fiction. She's written numerous books about vampires. She does the lecture circuit. She is a leader within an esoteric group called House Keperu. And she even appears on shows like Paranormal State, where she works as a psychic. So there's not a whole lot that Michelle can't do.
Yeah, have you met her?
I have met her, yes, several times, and she is a very charismatic figure, and she's very sort of popular within the vampire community. But she's also very wary of becoming sort of a hierarchical figure. She doesn't want to do that, but she has definitely set herself up as an intellectual leader for this community.
And to her, this is a very valid community. The vampire community is, and even the psychic vampire community, she regards that as a community that is in need of support because psychic vampires can transform themselves into something positive.
That's right. A lot of the idea of this community is that you can take that person that drains all the energy out of the room, and you can sort of teach them what they are, and they can learn to feed in a way that is ethical and is actually helpful to everyone instead of harmful. So they've said that they don't have to take your energy that you need to go through your day, that they could actually feed on, say, your stress energy, right? They could help kind of relax you, and that could be their source of nourishment. Right? So there's a lot of literature coming out right now from this community about rethinking the psychic vampire, not as something that is a threat or something dangerous, but something that could actually be helpful. So it's begun to sort of ally with movements like Reiki and different ways of healing with energy.
That's fascinating, because I've always viewed psychic vampirism as a very negative thing, and I've often wondered what it actually was, because there's no question but that it exists. There are people like that. I've met them, you've met them. But as a scholar, I'm sure you don't think of them in terms of the supernatural at all. So what do you think they're doing? What happens?
Well, it's interesting. You're right. As a religion scholar, that's sort of beyond what I can talk about legitimately within academia as to what's actually going on. On the other hand, one issue that came up when I was working with the vampires is it's like, you don't believe that this energy exists, and so you can't really understand us, right? If you don't if you can't experience the things we experience. So to kind of try to bridge that gap, I did attend an energy workshop at an open house that was run by Michel Belanger. And I did some very simple exercises with some of these vampires to try and sort of feel the energy that they can almost always perceive in the room around them. And when I did these exercises, I did actually feel sensations on my sort of fingertips and my palms and so forth. Now, did I feel subtle energy? Is that what vampires eat? I don't know, but I do know that I had this sort of experience, and so that gave me some sort of window into what the world must look like for them. One interesting theory as to what's actually going on is Michelle talked to someone from China that did sort of traditional energy healing from China, and his diagnosis of what Michelle actually sort of was as a vampire was that part of her sort of the anatomy of her energy was actually missing, right? I think he said that her hara point was missing, and so all the energy in her system just sort of fell out the bottom. And he actually offered to meet with some other experts from China, and he said, we're going to try to fix you. We're going to try to make a new hara so that your energy body will be complete and that you won't be this sort of vampire anymore. And Michelle said, maybe 10 years ago I might have been interested in that, but now I'm comfortable with what I am, and I don't need to be fixed. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of theories and explanations come out of this in the next coming years.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think there are an awful lot of people around like this. I also don't think that most vampires are in the community of vampires at all. And when we get back, we're going to talk to Joe about just what is going on out there. Are there people who are practicing this in secret? And did he come into any of the more hidden parts of the vampire world? People who are totally on their own and would never dream of joining a group? We'll be right back. We're talking to Joseph Laycock. Joe's book, Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism. And, you'd think, I'm not interested in vampires, but you will be if you pick this book up. I know that people who have read Twilight or Anne Rice's books or my books on vampires, you're going to find this as fascinating, I'm sure, as I did. I went down some very dark paths when I was studying vampirism, especially the first time when I was doing research in Manhattan for The Hunger. I blundered around a lot and blundered into a fantastically bizarre and frankly openly dangerous community of people who were involved in, I don't know what it was, some sort of sadomasochistic sexual ritualization or something. And I came to them through a person who told me he was a vampire and that he needed to be near people who were suffering in order to feed himself. That was a psychic vampirism, and that's why he was involved in this S&M thing. And I am thinking, I'm wondering, are there a lot of people out there like this who would never say, I am a vampire, I am a psychic vampire, would never join a group in a sense, who do need suffering in order to survive? Is that real at all, or are they just all crazy?
Well, we do know from this research that the Atlanta Vampire Alliance did that the majority of the vampires are solitary. The majority of them are alone most of the time and are not part of any sort of local group or anything like that. And, of course, there is this other meaning of the term psychic vampire as someone that does sort of, feed their ego by sort of manipulating everyone around them and sort of spreading suffering. A lot of the psychic vampires describe how the sort of emotional content of the energy that they receive can be more or less nourishing. So there's certainly a lot that say that something like, watching a scene of sadomasochism would be a very sort of rich feast energetically, right? There's a lot of sort of negative energy there that you can feed on. But people have also said that positive emotions can be sustaining as well, and it sort of depends on the vampire as to what kind of their preferred diet is. So Michelle has said one of the richest sources of energy you could find is say a Pentecostal church service, right? That the people there in the service sort of in religious ecstasy is this tremendous amount of kind of positive energy that's very nourishing. But there certainly are these vampires that prefer, for whatever reason, to only feed on some sort of the more darker, sort of more primal energies. So things like sadomasochism are very popular with a lot of vampires, and in part because it's a good way for a psychic vampire to feed.
Well, I find that fascinating because I also wonder now how many vampires, I mean psychic vampires, I think the people who drink blood and so forth. Well, let me backtrack for a second. Is there anything that medically that might compel people to need to drink blood?
Well, this is something that's been debated for a long time, and one thing I talk about in the book was this paper in the 80s that people who drink blood actually suffer from porphyria, right, which is a disease that causes depletion of certain enzymes in your blood. And there was a theory that people with this disease could replenish those enzymes by drinking the blood of other people. And this was just sort of a theory that some doctor put forth at a medical conference, and people kind of ran wild with it, and it got a whole lot of media coverage. And this caused tremendous problems for people who actually suffered from the disease porphyria. In some cases, their husbands and wives thought that they were going to drink their blood now because they had this disease, and of course that wasn't the case. So for a long time, people have been looking for a sort of medical explanation, or if we can just find the one disease that would explain blood drinking. But I tend to think that's going to be a dead end. I don't think anyone's ever going to sort of find the one kind of medical explanation for vampirism.
Boy, I can't tell you how yucky the idea of drinking raw blood seems to me personally. Yet, I guess there are people who do it, and they, as you said earlier, they use animals mostly, et cetera, and so forth. But, to each his own. I think that there is a lot of psychic vampirism at high levels in politics and business. That some of the people I've met in those positions in this world are radically different from ordinary people, and when you're with them, there's an oppressive feeling of presence about them. Some of them aren't, but I've met some that were, and they were shocking. And I wonder if this isn't a sort of adaptation, that there are people out there feeding on others, and that it doesn't actually color our culture very deeply, more deeply than we realize. Now, how deep do you think psychic vampirism goes in the culture? How much of a part of our world is it really?
Well, I mean, I think that you're absolutely right, that if you define psychic vampirism as sort of feeding off of other people's energy, or especially feeding off of other people's attention, that it's absolutely fundamental to our society. Michelle has argued that acting and even teaching is a mild form of psychic vampirism. And I can kind of relate to that as a teacher and now as a lecturer at Boston University. If I give a lecture to 100 people and it goes really well and they're really paying attention to what I'm saying, then I do feel sort of energized for the rest of the day. I get kind of a high out of that. Right? Does that make me a psychic vampire? I'm not sure. The other theory that has been proposed is that this is an adaptation of sort of living in an increasingly more urban and industrial society. And there is a theory that we sort of, as human beings, we used to be sort of recharged by being around natural settings and working the land and being around fresh water and forests and so forth. And now that so many of us live in cities, we can't get that sort of vitality anymore, and so we take it from one another. So that's another theory as to why there could possibly be this resurgence of psychic vampirism.
I guess what I'm thinking about is this. people like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, or people like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, these people who come to the center of certain societies they're like a nexus of darkness. And in the case certainly of Stalin, there was some kind of a feeding going on. He killed people simply because he could, and he spread fear simply because he could. And I think that there is I don't think it's new. I think if you go back across history, you find again and again, for example, in a kind of an open monarchy like the Roman system, where it wasn't hereditary. Again and again, people like that rose to the top and killed and killed and killed. I think it's a greater danger than we realize, frankly, myself.
Well, I think you're certainly right that the people you're describing, people like Hitler and Stalin, are not ordinary people. And I think you can look at this either through more conventional psychology and say that they have sort of some kind of ego deficiency in sort of a personality disorder that causes them to behave in this way, or through the more sort of esoteric lens and say that they are in fact a type of psychic vampire. And ultimately, I suppose it doesn't really matter, right? Both explanations tend to kind of take you to the same place, that there is this type of person out there, and I think you're right, that there is a potential danger when egos like that are allowed to sort of feed as much as they want.
Exactly. And in this case, I think that these are people who needed the food of human suffering in ways that we don't really fully understand yet. Now, I want to talk about the Highgate vampire, as we're getting close to the end of our time together, and this was an absolutely fascinating thing. When I was living in London in 1968, I went to Highgate Cemetery a few times, and it was a mess. It's much, much improved. They've cleaned it up a great deal, but it was full of fascinating graves. I knew nothing about any Highgate vampire at the time. Tell us the story of the Highgate vampire.
Well, the Highgate vampire, this has been written on extensively by Bill Ellis, who is a folklorist. But in the 70s, people began seeing various apparitions in this very old cemetery in London. It's a very old, very beautiful, overgrown Victorian cemetery. There is speculation that this cemetery might be obliquely referenced in Dracula. And in the 70s, people began seeing various types of ghosts and apparitions, and there didn't seem to be a clear pattern to what people were seeing. One person would see, a woman in white, and someone else would see some other type of ghost, or I think there was even a phantom bicycler seen at one point. But eventually, out of sort of all this attention, this rumor began to spread that there was a vampire living in the Highgate Cemetery. And so this attracted two amateur vampire hunters who both arrived and said that they were going to slay the vampire. And so these two men sort of became kind of rivals, and there was sort of an escalation of who was going to be the one to finally open all the tombs and track down this vampire and kill it. And the result was a sort of mass hysteria. Tremendous damage was done to this old cemetery. And, of course, police described arriving in the morning and finding tombs thrown open and even remains of human bodies, left on the walk of the cemetery and so forth. And the cemetery did not have the funds to sort of repair the damage that was done by this vampire hunt.
That must be why when I saw it, there were a lot of torn up tombs and open tombs. I didn't realize it at the time. That's absolutely fascinating. But go ahead.
That's right. So this is a very famous cemetery. Karl Marx is buried here, and more recently Douglas Adams, the author of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is buried here. And I think they sold it for something like £50 because of this damage that was done by vampire hunters. So a group of private investors who wanted to support this old cemetery purchased it and sort of built the gates higher. And they got rid of a lot of the overgrowth, but they wanted to keep certain sections overgrown because they did like that sort of creepy old Victorian kind of mystique that the cemetery had, but they had to do it in a way where people were no longer causing this type of damage. And these two vampire hunters have since written books, sort of both claiming that they were the one that actually did find and ultimately slay this creature that was responsible for all the sightings in the Highgate Cemetery.
Well, we'll never know for sure. Of course, who knows, in a country where Spring-Heeled Jack once leapt, and most of my listeners will know exactly who Spring-Heeled Jack was, there's no telling what might have been going on at Highgate Cemetery. Joe Laycock, thank you so much for being with us. Vampires Today, the truth about modern vampirism. Don't miss it. It's informative. It's fun. It's a really interesting journey into a hidden secret and, frankly, probably a more dangerous world than we would like to believe. Thank you, Joe. To something. And then, about a month or two later, I received information, or rather read in the newspaper, I guess, that she had disappeared. I always wondered about that, Joe. I had no evidence, nothing to offer the police whatsoever. But what do you think happened? In your book, you come up with a very different theory, that she wasn't actually eaten by vampires, but something else quite interesting and unexpected happened to her.
Right. Well, it's certainly an amazing story, the disappearance of Susan Walsh, and of course this inspired Catherine Ramsland, who is also a journalist amongst other things, to write her book Piercing the Darkness, where she sort of goes looking to find out what happened to Susan Walsh. I was getting my driver's license when Susan Walsh disappeared. I was in high school. And so what I did researching this book was I was able to speak to some of sort of the old guard vampires from the New York scene. And
Point, autographed by me, the hardcover of the Omega Point, autographed by me if you renew your existing subscription to unknowncountry.com for 1 year, or if you start a new 1-year subscription to unknowncountry.com. That has to happen for the next week. That is the next 7 days from Friday, July the 9th at 6 a.m. till Friday, July the 16th at midnight. You are guaranteed to get an autographed copy of the Omega Point, but you must subscribe for a year or more, or renew your existing subscription for a year or more in order to get this premium. So go to unknowncountry.com and click on that subscribe tab, or if you are a subscriber, go into your account and extend your subscription for a year. You need do nothing else. The copy will come automatically. This promotion is valid for U.S. mailing addresses only. Unfortunately, we cannot afford to ship these premiums abroad.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
Well, as you know, I have a certain amount of interest in vampires, having written The Hunger back in the day, and then more recently The Last Vampire and Lilith's Dream. And I have always taken quite an interest in this field, in that when I was doing research for The Hunger, I got into the dark side of it a little bit. And not that it's necessarily true that there are any real vampires around, but there are certainly some very peculiar people around, as we're going to find out today from Joe Laycock. Joe Laycock has written a book called Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism, and he is a doctoral candidate at Boston University. And with that said, I'd like to welcome you to the show, Joe.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's exciting to have you, and I really must say that I enjoyed Vampires Today. I want to start out with a story that I know a little bit about, which is the story of Susan Walsh, which you comment on in your book. I met Susan Walsh about a month before, I guess, she disappeared. And folks, for those of you who don't know, Susan was an aspiring reporter for the Village Voice, and she was running around trying to do stories while working, I believe, as a pole dancer or stripper or something. I forget exactly what she said, but she was wanting to break into reporting, and she had decided to do a story about vampires, real vampires in Manhattan. And she contacted me because of the fact that I had written The Hunger, and she thought that I might have some idea, I might have done some research that could help her. And I wasn't able to give her any particular leads, but I was able to tell her that it was, there were people, there was a community, a sort of Gothic community in Manhattan at the time, and she said an interesting thing to me. She said, well, she knew all about them and that she was really on all vampires of the world with a concentration on the vampires of New York City, the very ones that I explored when I was doing research for my book, The Hunger. There's something very eerie out there, folks. And then for subscribers at the Dreamland Festival, I had an extraordinary experience. Marla Fries was channeling and doing her work as a medium when suddenly the dead, my dead and my wife's dead, showed up in my life. There followed a communication which is beyond dispute real. And for subscribers, we talk about that. We explain why it was so real, why it had to be real, and exactly what it was. It's a moving and deeply amazing thing as far as I'm concerned. I never dreamed I could do anything like that, especially not in such a credible and provable way. It just blew me away. So subscribers, don't miss it. And also, if you're not a subscriber, now's your chance. You can get a copy of the Omega listing subscription to unknowncountry.com for 1 year, or if you start a new 1 year subscription to unknowncountry.com. That has to happen for the next week. That is the next 7 days from Friday, July the 9th at 6 a.m. till Friday, July the 16th at midnight. You are guaranteed to get an autographed copy of the Omega Point. But you must subscribe for a year or more, or renew your existing subscription for a year or more in order to get this premium. So go to unknowncountry.com and click on that subscribe tab, or if you are a subscriber, go into your account and extend your subscription for a year. You need do nothing else. The copy will come automatically. This promotion is valid for U.S. mailing addresses only. Unfortunately, we cannot afford to ship these premiums abroad.
You're listening to Dreamland. Serious wonder spoken here.
Well, as you know, I have a certain amount of interest in vampires, having written The Hunger back in the day, and then more recently, The Last Vampire.
Right. Well, it's certainly an amazing story, the disappearance of Susan Walsh, and of course, this inspired Catherine Ramsland, who is also a journalist, amongst other things, to write her book Piercing the Darkness, where she sort of goes looking to find out what happened to Susan Walsh. I was, getting my driver's license when Susan Walsh disappeared. I was in high school. And so what I did researching this book was I was able to speak to some of sort of the old guard vampires from the New York scene. And of course what's happened is that if you were a vampire in Manhattan around the time that Susan Walsh disappeared, then you're very sort of respected, and you have a lot of sort of mystique in the community. And so unfortunately, from talking to different vampires that had sort of had a fallen out, I got different accounts of what had happened. I think the most likely explanation that I heard, and one vampire that I spoke with is now involved in law enforcement, is that probably her disappearance was related to an article that she had
in Lilith Stream. And I have always taken quite an interest in this field, in that when I was doing research for The Hunger, I got into the dark side of it a little bit. And not that it's necessarily true that there are any real vampires around, but there are certainly some very peculiar people around, as we're going to find out today from Joe Laycock. Joe Laycock has written a book called Vampires Today, The Truth About Modern Vampirism, and he is a doctoral candidate at Boston University, And with that said, I'd like to welcome you to the show, Joe.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, it's exciting to have you, and I really must say that I enjoyed vampires today. I want to start out with a story that I know a little bit about, which is the story of Susan Walsh, which you comment on in your book. I met Susan Walsh about a month before, I guess, she disappeared. And folks, for those of you who don't know, Susan was an aspiring reporter for the Village Voice, and she was running around trying to do stories while working, I believe, as a pole dancer or stripper or something. I forget exactly what she said, but she was wanting to break into reporting, and she had decided to do a story about vampires, real vampires in Manhattan. And she contacted me because of the fact that I had written The Hunger, and she thought that I might have some idea, I might have done some research that could help her. And I wasn't able to give her any particular leads, but I was able to tell her that it was, there were people, there was a community, a sort of Gothic community in Manhattan at the time, and she said an interesting thing to me. She said, well, she knew all about them and that she was really on to something. And then, about a month or two later, I received information, or rather read in the newspaper, I guess, that she had disappeared. I always wondered about that, Joe. I had no evidence, nothing to offer the police whatsoever. But what do you think happened? And in your book, you come up with a very different theory, that she wasn't actually eaten by vampires, but something else quite interesting and unexpected happened to her.
Right.
Vampires of the world, with a concentration on the vampires of New York City, the very ones that I explored when I was doing research for my book, The Hunger. There's something very eerie out there, folks. And then for subscribers at the Dreamland Festival, I had an extraordinary experience. Marla Fries was channeling and doing her work as a medium when suddenly the dead, my dead and my wife's dead, showed up in my life. There followed a communication which is beyond dispute real. And for subscribers, we talk about that. We explain why it was so real, why it had to be real, and exactly what it was. It's a moving and deeply amazing thing as far as I'm concerned. I never dreamed I could do anything like that, especially not in such a credible and provable way. It just blew me away. So subscribers, don't miss it. And also, if you're not a subscriber, now's your chance. You can get a copy of the Omega Point autographed by me, the hardcover of the Omega Point autographed by me, if you renew your existing